Welcome to Bosco Campus Vision. You're watching the campus television channel of Don Bosco College, Kottayam. This lecture is on the prescribed syllabus of 5th semester BA English Literature and Language. Paper is Literary Criticism. In this lecture, I am going to deal with the classical writer Plato. His time period is circa, that means around 429 to 347 BC. Plato is acclaimed as the first systematic critic of literature and is one of the most dazzling writers in the Western literary tradition. An Athenian citizen of high status who displays in his works his absorption in the political events and intellectual movements of his time. The questions raised by him are so profound and the strategies he uses for tackling them so richly suggestive and provocative that educated readers nearly every period have in some way been influenced by him. In his famous work, Dialogue, Plato has clearly explained his ideas and ideologies of literary criticism. Plato was the first to enunciate the classical ideals of artistic beauty in his description of the poetic ideals of austerity, order, and restraint. He emphasized for the first time that organic unity is essential for success in all arts. He was also the first to emphasize the value of decorum in art. Plato's classification of poetry into lyric, epic, and dramatic originated the classification of poetry based on forms and styles. Plato stated that the function of poetry is the moulding of human character and not merely the giving of pleasure. Plato introduced the concept of mimesis as an essential characteristic of all art, that is, art for life's sake. Plato attacks poetry on 4 grounds: moral, intellectual, emotional, and utilitarian. First is moral. Poets are more concerned with popular taste, and as such, they narrate tales of pleasant vices. Poets lie about gods and represent them as corrupt, immoral, and dishonest. Drama is even more harmful because judgment in dramatic matters is left to the multitude and the result is lawlessness. Second is intellectual. Poets have no knowledge of truth as they imitate illusions instead of reality. Third is emotional. Poets are divinely inspired. It implies that poetry originates from a supernatural force outside their personality. Hence, poetic creations are unreliable and uncertain. Epics, tragedies, comedies are imitative, and Plato regards imitative poetry as pernicious. Imitative poetry abounds in the vulgar, the sensational, and the corrupt because it is easier to imitate the baser part of soul. Tragedy gives unrestricted expression to the emotions of pity and grief. They feed and water the passions instead of drying them up. Fourth is utilitarian. Poetry serves no useful purpose because the poet merely imitates the surface of things without knowing how to use or make them. According to Plato, art is potentially dangerous for several reasons. First, art is essentially deceptive. Second, art is mainly concerned with sensual pleasure. Third, art is psychologically destabilizing, that is for the individual. Fourth is art leads to immorality. Fifth, art is politically dangerous, that is, threat to the common good. Plato's views are diverse and even contradictory. On one hand, he is opposed to art as an end in itself, and on the other hand, he glorifies and extols the artist and emphasizes his role in human life. Sir Philip Sidney said, "Of all philosophy, I have esteemed him most worthy of reverence, and with great reason, since of all philosophers he is the most poetical." He was a philosopher and poet rolled into one. As a pathfinder, he inspired people and gave direction to criticism and stimulated it. Poetry is not just a matter of words and technique, but is a lofty and mysterious creation of man. No wonder that Plato is regarded as the fountain of that which is most living in the orthodoxy of later ages. In the words of Atkins, and his influence remains to the present day that of one of the greatest of critics, in the truest sense a light bringer, ever guiding men's steps to the spiritual side of art. It must be said to the credit of Plato that he did literature and literary study a great service. Plato concludes his charges against poetry with the comment that no poetry should be admitted, say hymns to the gods and panegyrics on famous men. Plato declares poets are to be honored, but they should be banished from the ideal state. Next is Plato's Mimesis or Plato's Theory of Imitation. The word mimesis is derived from Greek and means imitation of the voice and gestures of another. Plato, the first systematic critic in the world of literature, declared that all arts are mimetic or imitative, and they give pleasure, but they deal in falsehood as they do not portray reality. The media of the artists may be different, but they all copy life. Plato argues that the literal copying of reality in both literature and visual art is a futile and misleading pursuit because of the nature of reality itself and of our limited perception of it. According to Plato's famous theory of ideas, everything that exists in this world is an imperfect copy of an ideal object that exists outside the substance and time scale of the world as we perceive it. The creations of poets and artists are mere copies of ideal reality. Their creations are third-hand distortions of truth, valueless and potentially misleading. The artist deals only with the appearance of an appearance. To understand this, let us take an example of a bed. A bed made by a carpenter is only an imitation of the ideal bed in the mind of the carpenter. The artist who paints the picture of that bed is only producing an imitation of an imitation. Now look at the pictures given below. The first picture, that is the bed in carpenter's mind. See the second picture. This is the bed created by the carpenter, and this bed is the imitation of the real bed that is there in the mind of the carpenter. So, the bed that is in the mind of the carpenter is the real one or ideal one. When the carpenter creates that bed is the imitation of the real bed that is there in the mind of the carpenter. Now look at the third picture. When an artist paints this bed that is created by the carpenter, he sees that bed and he looks at the bed and creates that bed or makes the painting of that bed, then that bed becomes an imitation of imitation. Yes, so the second picture is the imitation of the real one that is there in the carpenter's mind. Yes, then that is the real one. Second is the imitation, first imitation. Third picture is the imitation of imitation. And why it is called imitation of imitation? Because the third picture, that is the painting of this bed, is the imitation of the one which is created by the carpenter. That is an imitation of the real object that is there in the mind of the carpenter. Okay, so the bed that is in the mind of the carpenter is the real or ideal one, and the carpenter who creates that or who makes that bed is the imitation of the real one. And third picture, when a painter paints that bed, that becomes an imitation of imitation. Yes, so this becomes an imperfect copy of an ideal object. Okay, so the creations of the poets and artists are mere copies of ideal reality. So their creations are third-hand distortions of truth. Yes, so the bed that is painted by the artist, that becomes a third-hand distortion of truth. And what is truth? Truth is the real one, the ideal one that is there in the mind of the carpenter. So according to Plato's theory of ideas, everything that exists in this world is an imperfect copy of an ideal object. The creations of poets and artists are mere copies of ideal reality. Their creations are said to be the third-hand distortion of truth. Yes, that becomes valueless and potentially misleading. Plato's ethical views stood in the way of his artistic appreciation of art. He failed to see that the artist is not a teacher but a seer, one who gives his own visions of an object. He applies his perception and tries to capture the soul of reality, which is something more than visible reality. In this lecture, I have talked about the classical writer Plato, then Plato's Mimesis and his theory of ideas. Now, do the given exercise and submit on time. Thank you.